Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to GITVC in the virtual community. We're going to start by asking everyone to please mute themselves so we can get started here. Perfect, thank you. So we are GITVC in the virtual community, and we are delighted to bring another important topic to our community today. Today's topic is titled, His Family Came First, His Health Came Second. What do we do when Black men's health and values conflict? And today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Derek Griffith as our presenter, and he is the director of Georgetown Center for Men's Health Equity. We also have Florencia Gonzalez as our moderator, and she is the co-director of Diverse Populations Core here with us at GITVC. So as I mentioned, we just have a few housekeeping items. So as I said, please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. We will be having time towards the end for questions and answers, and you'll be able to ask your questions via the chat box or by muting yourself at that time. If you are interested in learning more about our presentation, research studies, and Dr. Griffith's work, we will be sharing a lot of those links on the chat. So please be in the lookout and feel free to grab that information from there. And we absolutely want to hear your feedback. We take that very serious. So we will be sharing a link to a survey at the end, and we encourage everyone to take it for us. So here's our quick agenda. We are going to, Florencia is going to speak about the importance of diversity in clinical research. And after that, we're going to have Dr. Derek Griffith do his presentation on men's health. So what is GITVC? A lot of you guys are probably wondering what GITVC is. And GITVC stands for Georgetown Howard University's Center for Clinical and Translational Science. And it is a partnership between medical institutions created to transform clinical research so that new treatments and cures for disease can be delivered to patients more effectively. And our goal here at GITVC primarily is to increase health research awareness in the community, as well as increase diversity and participation in research. We support researchers who design and implement research that will have high impact in all of our communities. So we created GITVC in the virtual community, which is what you're part of today. And so we did this, started because of COVID, and we found that this is a great way to stay connected to our community. So we're going to keep it going for as long as we can. This is a quarterly presentation, and this provides the opportunity for investigators in our institutions to speak about their work and their studies, and to allow our community to learn more about various studies that we support. We invite everyone to join us on Facebook and our various platforms, which we will be introducing later. This is a quick snapshot of the team that, collaborates in making this happen. There are no particular disclosures today to Dr. Griffith's presentations, and Florencia Gonzalez also doesn't have any potential conflicts of interest when it comes to this presentation. So our moderator today, as I mentioned, is our dearest Florencia Gonzalez, and she is the co-director of the Inclusion and Diverse Populations Core here at GITVC. She specializes on leading efforts to establish community academic partnerships for inclusion of underrepresented groups in health research. She has prior experience managing clinical trials and overseeing disparity health research within community settings. Additionally, she has a history of grassroots field experience conducting case management with immigrant populations and managing public health projects in cross-cultural settings such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Honduras. So Florencia will take it from here.
Okay, if you can please skip a slide and let me know if you're having a hard time hearing me.
We can hear you okay, Florencia.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Not this one?
Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, good evening. So my presentation is going to be short and sweet. I want to make sure we give enough time to Dr. Griffith for his wonderful presentation and Q&A. So before I go into my presentation about the importance of diverse representation in clinical research, I would like to take a few moments to provide a brief description of clinical trials. Clinical trials test new ways to understand, diagnose, prevent, and treat diseases. There are different terms used for clinical trials, such as studies or health research, which I may be using interchangeably throughout my presentation. So since COVID-19 has emerged, there has been a worldwide focus on clinical trials to better prevent, diagnose, and treat COVID-19. This coverage has also brought greater attention to the need of diverse representation in clinical trials by racially and ethnic diverse groups, particularly because of these groups were the most affected by COVID. Next slide, please. And as many of us know, historically, Blacks, Hispanics, and other ethnic or racial groups have been not well represented in clinical trials. This chart, for instance, shows the disproportion of Black and Hispanic participation in studies. As you can see, Blacks represent 12% of the US population, but only 5% participate in clinical trials. Similarly, Hispanics comprise 16% of the population, but only 1% of Hispanics participate in clinical trials. Clearly, there is a need for greater participation by these groups and other groups who have not been well represented, despite a slightly better effort by study funders and by researchers to focus on making efforts to increase diversity. We are seeing somewhat of an improvement, but we still have a long way to go. Next slide, please. And there are multiple reasons for the lack of participation by diverse groups. There are past unethical practices that have led to mistrust in health research. You may have heard of Tuskegee, the unethical practices that took place with this particular trial, or the Henrietta Lacks trials of her cells being used without her or her family's permission. So certainly these are very good reasons for the mistrust in health research, though we have also come a long way in implementing policies and practices to safeguard participants. Lack of transportation participants can play a role too in lack of participation. Low socioeconomic status can also have an impact. Lack of awareness about clinical trials by diverse groups. Doctors may not communicate to their patients about clinical trials that are going on. And also lack of investment in time and resources by the study team to recruit diverse groups, including people with limited English proficiency. And this is something that our team, GUTS, is really trying to make an effort to help investigators with strategies for inclusion so that they are able to put the necessary resources to ensure that diverse groups are welcomed into research. There's also researcher bias. Researchers, for example, can assume people of color may not want to be involved in research, so they're not asked. So these are some examples of why there may be lack of diverse representation. Next slide, please. However, as we mentioned before, it is very important that ethnically, racially, and culturally diverse groups, as well as other groups who have been historically underrepresented in health research, such as those with disability, be included in clinical trials. Including diverse groups of individuals in research provides confidence that research results will apply to a wider range of people. Genetics can sometimes also play a role in how a person responds to a medicine. So having that diversity in the trial is critical. Factors like a person's age may also have an impact on the side effects experience. Specific groups of people may have higher incidence of certain diseases like cancer, hypertension, or diabetes. One of our Howard University infectious disease clinicians and COVID-19 vaccine researcher stated the following. Her name is Dr. Siha Majoo, and she's doing studies at with a concerted effort to include diverse groups. And she says very beautifully, as quoted in this slide, give me a second, I'll pull it up. She says, Black and Latino communities have an unequal burden of chronic health conditions like cancer, heart disease, and hypertension, oftentimes with more than one of these health problems. If vaccine trials includes Black and Latinos with these diverse medical histories, we can have greater confidence that vaccines will be safe for people with a wide range of health conditions. And I really do think that Dr. Majid is getting at the heart of the importance of why we need diverse representation, not only for COVID trials, but also for other trials of varying diseases. So how can you get involved? Next slide, please. Okay. I have to pull my slides back up. I'm working on a very small computer today. So you can ask your healthcare provider about different treatment plans when confronted with a given disease, and how you can become involved in an ongoing clinical trial if they're available. You can consider joining a community advisory board or a patient advisory board, especially if you're interested in rare diseases that usually have groups, advocacy groups for that particular disease. We can also, if you don't have readily available access to a community advisory board that can influence research, or a patient advisory board, we can certainly provide you more information, and we will be providing more information towards the end, but you can also always reach out to us, and we can guide you through that process. You can also educate yourself. We have a wonderful resource. It's called Let's Talk About Clinical Research that we've developed that provides terminology, clinical research terminology. It provides just a variety of information to better inform you so you can make an informed decision if choosing to participate in a clinical trial. And I would say the most important thing to walk away with is the fact that participating in a clinical trial is voluntary. You can, it's a position where you volunteer, and you can always leave a trial at any point in the trial. No one should ever make you feel like you or coerce you into participating in a trial. So we'll be happy to share more resources. We'll be placing the links in the chat. And that's it for my presentation. And I'm going to hand it over. So I'll do a brief introduction of Dr. Griffith and then hand it over to him. So Dr. Griffith is the founding co-director for the Racial Justice Institute, the founder and director for the Center for Men's Health Equity, and a professor of health management and policy and oncology at Georgetown University. His research focuses on developing strategies to achieve racial, ethnic, and gender equity in health. Dr. Griffith also serves on the MedStar Health Research Institute Board of Directors. Welcome, Dr. Griffith.
Thank you very much, Florencia. Thank you to the rest of the GUTS team for this invitation and opportunity, and for just working with us, me and my team, on the various projects that we're doing now. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about what for many of you may find a strange place. We're going to go inside the minds of particularly Black men, and in this Prostate Cancer Awareness Month, really we're going to talk less explicitly about prostate cancer and more about the context in which we're dealing with, and men who have developed or are diagnosed with prostate cancer or may have concerns about prostate cancer are dealing with that, and what is the larger context in which those things are occurring. So next slide. So let me begin by acknowledging my team here at the Center for Men's Health Equity and our current funders of our particular projects. And I'm also going to briefly talk at the end about a current project, since we were talking about clinical trials and things people may want to get involved in. Clinical trials are not just about trials that are testing drugs and are in sort of biomedical settings, clinical trials also can include community-based settings. And so we actually have a study that we're conducting called Mighty Men that we'll talk about at the end. Next slide. So COVID has definitely, as you all well know and are living through, I don't need to tell you how COVID has affected us as a community, as a world. And it certainly has been a phenomena that's taken over our larger context and been overshadowed pretty much everything that we've done over the last 2+ years. Next slide. One of the things that we've seen is it's rare, and again, without keeping you here, trying not to keep you here all night, I only included one slide to sort of highlight this, but one of the things typically that you see is that life expectancy for, if I were to show you over about the last 120 years, has typically increased, to some degree from year to year. Since 2018 or 2019, right before the pandemic, we've actually seen in the United States a decline in life expectancy, and we saw that dramatically accelerated during the COVID period. We saw that in particular in the first 6 months for non-Hispanic Black men, who and some updated data showed that non-Hispanic Black men lost between 2019 and 2021 approximately 4.6 years of life expectancy, and that was only second to Hispanic men who lost 4.7 years, and non-Hispanic Alaskan Indian, American Indian, and Alaska Native men who lost 7.1, and American Indian, Alaska Native women who lost 5.8 years. Again, if you think about this, we don't tend to think about these kinds of issues in this bigger context, but COVID has become the third leading cause of death for Americans. And so in the context of talking about dealing with prostate cancer, part of what I wanted to start with is this larger picture of understanding COVID and how it's affecting men in particular. Part of this also picture, and why I wanted to start here, is to highlight again, and many of you probably also know this, that Black men's life expectancy was much shorter. So even though they weren't necessarily the ones who lost the most in terms of life expectancy, Black men started with the shortest life expectancy of any of these groups, with the exception of American Indian, Alaska Native men. And so our decline from 71.3 years to now just past retirement age of 66.7 years. So Black men's life expectancy is just now past life, the idea that you're going to retire and basically or likely to die and within 2 years is a striking thing to conceptualize and find, and that we have to understand what this context does and how we got to this point. Next slide. So one of the things that I want to highlight is this idea of how do we, again, understand the perspective, the context. What have we really lost in losing Black men during this pandemic? And Akela Johnson did a beautiful job, and Nina Martin, did a beautiful job a few years ago of characterizing what it meant to lose this generation of young Black men, and really highlighted this idea of John Henryism as part of that story. And part of this I want to do in talking about the context of prostate cancer for Black men is also to make sure that we understand and celebrate the strengths of Black men and what it means to be a Black man. And that we need to also, if we're going to develop interventions, we have to start from strengths. We have to start from what are the things that we have as assets in our community, assets in ourselves, and build from those. You can't build from weakness. We have to build from strength. So next slide. So part of what she talked about is that this idea of, if you were to characterize the people that were lost, that have died during the pandemic, particularly as it relates to Black men and the disproportionate rate of Black men, that this idea of a modern John Henry sort of existed, that when you talked about the characteristics of these men, again, regardless of age, and she was characterizing in terms of young Black men because they were a disproportionate rate of those who were dying, who were not older adults, when we were sort of prioritizing the focus on mortality of older adults. that you had these characteristics of being hardworking, ambitious, optimistic, and other things, trying to lift others up with them, you know, with themselves, that you had all these positive characteristics of these men. And that's really what we see. And in my work, we've seen in talking to, interviewing Black men and women associated with Black men, that when they're trying to aspire to be men, they're trying to aspire to embody these kind of characteristics, not the way that we traditionally sort of think about and criticize men for the ways that we tend to conceptualize what it means to be a man. Next slide. And so you had these men who were very ordinary, but because they were embodying these kinds of strengths, these were the kinds of things that we were talking about. And so part of this is, again, recognizing that part of the ordinariness is the strength that we're talking about, and to celebrate that this is normal to us. And this is what, when I think of the Black men in my community, in my life, in my family, these are the kinds of men that I'm thinking about. They are just, they do what they do, but they're also coming at this coming at their health from a standpoint of, it's important for me to be hardworking, to me to be an asset to my family, to my community, and so forth. Next slide. And so this concept of John Henryism is something that a scholar, Sherman James, identified probably in the actually it was about 40 years ago. 1983, I think, was the first paper where he described sort of John Henryism. And it's basically a category of these personal traits: tenacity and focus, mental and physical vigor, and a commitment to hard work. And this, if you're familiar with the story of John Henry, it's basically, you know, John Henry was known as the steel driving man. His job and during the time period when he was within this mythical time period, before there was sort of the Industrial Revolution, his job was to bore holes in a mountain, you know, with a hammer and to basically to create holes, to basically put explosives in, to basically, you know, create a hole through the mountain, to basically allow the trains to go through. And so there was this race of man versus machine. And, you know, part of the story, you know, it talks about how he was essentially the best at his job. He was the strongest and so forth. And so we've used this in the context of trying to characterize, again, these are the kinds of things that Black men are trying to embody, that they are committed to their work. They're committed to providing for their families. In some versions of the story, his wife and son are literally on the tracks watching him with this particular man versus machine competition. And while he's successful and he wins in this particular story, what is often missed is that he dies in the end, and he dies at the, you know, on the tracks, literally after he wins this particular race. And as morbid as that is, part of this is to recognize that we remember the story. We often retell the story as a story that's a very positive story. We tell it as a story of strength. And part of why I bring it up here is to remind us that we remember these men, we remember men for those positive assets, those strengths, those characteristics that they represent and that they embody, and that they're trying to show as part of their lives, as part of their communities, part of their families. And that those are the kinds of things they're prioritizing over their own health and well-being. And this is also a cautionary tale for Black men, in that we can work ourselves to death. We can basically prioritize our work over our health in a way that, yes, we may be able to put that additional food on the table or contribute to that household in such a way that is helpful, but it also may cause you to lose your life because you're prioritizing it too much. So that it's rarely striking. Part of what it's not a choice to not work hard. It's really recognizing that we have to help Black men find a way to strike a better balance between taking care of themselves, doing things that are for their own health and well-being, our own health and well-being, as well as working hard and doing those kinds of things. So it's trying to strike that better balance and not treat it as a choice. Next slide. And so basically what I'm going to talk about in just the remainder of this is, again, how do men think about themselves? particularly talk about prostate cancer and its links with depression, and then talk about the key role that women play often in men's prostate cancer journey. So again, one of the ways to think about men, and I start with all of these basic things about men and manhood, because the narratives that I hear when in my spaces tend to think of men as, you know, hard-headed, stubborn, all the negatives that you sort of hear, all the typical jokes, all the comedians make of things. You have the king of the hills, you have the, you know, all of those kinds of things of, you know, what men are supposed to be and do. But part of what you have to also understand is, how do men think about themselves? And, you know, while I'm looking at Winston Churchill and then talking about the context of Black men, there are these kinds of things that are common to men across racial and ethnic groups that we have to understand. Next slide. And so part of this understanding that idea of what we're trying to be a man is putting that in the context of COVID. And so you have these structural barriers. And in the piece that we did where we talked about how to explain that disproportionate mortality from Black men that we talked about earlier, we put it in the context of this concept called syndemics, which is basically, how do you understand why how do you explain this phenomena, usually of something like an infectious disease like COVID, and why would that disproportionately affect a particular population group? And we needed to anchor that in what are the contexts, what is the structural factors that we are talking about that would shape that particular context. And while we could talk about structural racism and talk about what that is and what that means, we thought it was particularly important to talk about what is unique about the experience in the ways that structural racism looks for Black men, and well, for being Black in general. And so what does anti-Black structural racism look like? And then how is that gendered? Meaning that there are unique stereotypes for Black men and Black women that shape the context of how Black men are experienced when they walk into different places, when they live their just general lives. And that has implications for the poor health profile that we tend to have in terms of high rates of heart disease, diabetes, and obesity, which in and of themselves can be risk factors for cancer, which we'll get to in a minute. But then you also have that as part of the context of shaping why you're more likely to develop COVID, is because you have that stress context and you have this particular stressful life environment and these additional predisposing factors that lead to men having this higher rate of not just, it wasn't actually that men were more likely to develop COVID, it was actually just that they were more likely to die from it. So it's important to distinguish that Black men weren't necessarily contracting COVID at higher rates, we were just dying from it at higher rates, and we were getting it at approximately the same level as everybody else. Next slide. So this is where the title came from. It was, for me doing qualitative work, this was one of my first papers, literally 15 years ago. When I was doing formative work around trying to understand the context in which Black men were making choices about their prostate cancer decision-making in rural North Carolina, and trying to understand the structural conditions and why there were certain choices and patterns that we were seeing. Again, not trying to limit it to the ways that we thought about the ways that Black men saw themselves, or just to the simplifying, to Black men don't want to go to the doctor, they don't want to get the DRE and the digital rectal exam and those kinds of things. But what is the context that shapes those choices, those decisions, those priorities? And so this idea that, a man was looking at his father and trying to describe what are some of the lessons that he learned that he then took on. And he was saying that his father forsaked his health to work. And it wasn't that he was so much worried about his health or wasn't worried about his health. He did care about his health. And it's an important message to understand that Black men do actually care. We actually do care about our health. It's just that his family came first and his health came second. And he didn't really try to focus and prioritize his health until it became its own problem in and of itself. And so that's part of what the message is today, is to really understand why Black men make some of the choices, why we do, and how that shapes the context of the choices that we're seeing in the health patterns that we see. Next slide. And so it's only theoretical, you know, as a health person and a public health person, you know, it's often that we assume and, you know, that health should be a high priority in people's lives. But if you think about why you value people in your life and who you usually value them for the sacrifices they make. Many people, you know, I value my mother for the sacrifices she made to, you know, take care of me and take time to do things with me and, you know, to prioritize my health and well-being over her own. And so this idea of simply being an adult, and I'm just using this context of Black men as part of this, but part of the idea of being an adult is that you often prioritize and sacrifice your health and well-being for those that you love and care for. And that's part of what love means in a very pragmatic sense. And so this idea of demonstrating how much, you know, the part of the love and part of the sacrifice is often prioritizing your earnings and ability to bring those kind of resources home. That is for some men, the way that they express love, even though they don't necessarily articulate it that way. Next slide. And so part of this is also to remember that if you think about health, that the way that we're sort of oriented, health is only one part of the things that you're trying to accomplish, you know, in your life. It's only one part of the bigger picture. You're trying to be successful in a career. You know, if you actually like your partner, you're trying to usually hold on to them. If you're trying to find some sense of happiness and fulfillment and well-being, many people have a faith, you know, tradition that they're really trying to honor and embody that gives them a sense of purpose and so forth. Trying to have enough money to do things that are important to you. Again, have a household, children and family, or just loved ones that you're trying to care for. And oh, by the way, you're supposed to take care of your own individual health. And so the point is to remember that health, while it's important, is not the only thing that we're dealing with. Next slide. As opposed to the way that health often gets characterized. And these are real ads. This is a real campaign. And in the interest of time, I'm only showing one of these. But this ad is something that the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality ran a few years ago. And I want to say they must have run it again recently because I'm seeing these things newly emerge. But this idea of, you know, thousands of men will die from stubbornness. And this campaign was an effort to try to get men to go get preventive screenings and preventive tests. And for those who know that, you know, that there's often this stereotype that women are more likely to get to go to the doctor than men. That the part of the way that is actually true is really about preventive screenings, preventive tests, and just well-person visits. When you actually look at, though, where it's not as true is when somebody is symptomatic, has minor issues or minor challenges, or even sometimes major. Like the difference between men and women tends to go away when you're actually thinking about if you have, you know, COVID symptoms, flu symptoms, you know, just not feeling well. Women are not necessarily more likely to go to the doctor when they're not feeling well. It's just that they're more likely to go to the doctor. The gap between men and women is primarily due to preventive screenings. So it is an important thing for men to go for preventive screening. The challenge is, should we only characterize this by thinking about, and is the source of the problem and the only source of the problem, men's stubbornness? So that and from a policy standpoint and from a practical standpoint, if you only locate the problem in men's heads and men's bodies, then it's nobody else's responsibility to actually have to do anything about it. It's not a responsibility of the healthcare community to demonstrate they're being more supportive, responsive, trustworthy. It's not a responsibility of the healthcare system to create clinics that are actually speaking to the needs and interests of men, to accommodate men's times and schedules and so forth. And so, next slide. You know, and so, yeah, men will respond. I just love this secondary part, but these are again real images that I was able to find of men responding, or presumably a man responding to this particular campaign. Next slide. So when we've done this work with Black men and talking about what it means to be a man, excuse me, and what health means to them, and those were literally the questions: what does being healthy mean to you? is we were struck and ended up doing this paper that looked at the parallels between these two concepts. And that broke down into this idea that what was common to their definition of what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be healthy were these three things. That it broke down to the embodying certain characteristics or who you are, what behaviors or what are the things that you're actually doing to demonstrate your both manhood and that you're healthy, and how you seek to affect others. So just quickly, the idea of being healthy was really about, being able to embody certain characteristics that were important and that were at this combination of what it meant to be a responsible adult, if you will. And so manhood, as opposed to the kind of stereotypical things of men being, the macho, the kinds of concepts that we tend to think about a men sort of, trying to be physically strong and aggressive and those kinds of things were not the types of things that men would describe that they were actually seeing that they were trying to do and the characteristics they were trying to embody. They were trying to be supportive, loving, caring, independent. And yes, they would actually use the word loving, even though some may not use that word directly with others. But they were talking about those kinds of things were the types of things they were trying to embody. What you do in terms of being healthy and being a man was to do things in the service of others and to be able to, again, being healthy in particular meant to be able to work a full day and not just come home and collapse on the couch, but to actually have and be able to be an active member of a family and of a community. And that there's this idea of health and manhood both being a relational definition, which is a fancy way of saying that health doesn't matter in and of itself. Health matters because it allows you to do something else. So health, I don't care about my health and I don't care about my body. Sometimes I will assume that my health, that my body is okay, or I won't pay attention to it. And the only thing that will get me to pay attention to my health and my body is when it starts to break down. And when it can't do what I want it to do, either that allows me to do things like work, like be intimate with a partner, like focus on things that are important to me. And so, or to live the full life that I want to be able to see the next generation of my family come and be there for them. And so this idea of how you're trying to affect others was part of this definition of both what a relational definition of health and this relational definition of manhood. Next slide. And so part of the reason that I mentioned and am transitioning a little bit to cancer in this talk, to depression in the context of providing that larger context for how we think about COVID, or the larger COVID context, to the work that we've done to understand how men talk about and think about both manhood and health, is, and now to switch to talking about prostate cancer and its relationship to depression, is because if you think about the ways that we were just talking about having this relational definition of health in particular and manhood, that when men develop prostate cancer, one of the things that often happens is it's a threat to who they are, to how they see themselves and how they typically defined who they are as men. And so the fact that you can't perform sexually, that you're having problems doing basic things like controlling your urine, controlling basically just not being able to do things that are sort of typical normal for you as an adult man, that it causes men sometimes to question whether or not they are in fact still the men that they thought they were. In addition to the fact that you have the context of, questioning their identity sometimes that can come with the digital rectal exam and which is one of the screeners for prostate problems. It's not explicitly a test for prostate cancer. It's a screening test that helps you see if there's a problem with the prostate that would then warrant further exploration. In addition to the prostate-specific antigen test, which is a blood test that also detects if there's something problematic going on in the prostate that needs to be further explored. And so those are the two screening tests typically for prostate problems that often are used to then further on explore issues related to prostate cancer. But as men are dealing with those kinds of issues, and you have this frequent relationship between prostate cancer, if you were to develop that, and clinical depression, that you see these patterns being somewhat similar, that 1 in 6 Black men are likely to develop prostate cancer in their life, as well as 1 in 6 are likely to develop, 1 of 6 of those are likely to develop depression. And one of the things, particularly in this region of the country, that we have to acknowledge is that there's significant heterogeneity in the Black population. And so one of the things that we have to better understand is how those from the West Indies and Caribbean, how those who are descendants of those who were born and raised in the United States proper, and how those who are born in various countries on the continent of Africa and potentially other places, how their experiences of these kinds of issues are different. And again, understand them in a way that helps us to contextualize and celebrate the ways that we need to build their strengths and build those networks so that men can have the best quality of life that is possible. Next slide. And so this is also just to acknowledge that one of the things we did in a study is looked at the depression criteria. And one of the things that we acknowledged is that when you talk to clinicians who treat men with depression, is that they would often talk about, as opposed to men expressing sadness, that they're less likely to potentially express sadness or depressed mood, but they are more likely to express things like, or agree to things like irritability, substance use, additional risk-taking behavior, anger outbursts, and so forth. And so men tend to engage in more externalizing behaviors when they're depressed, more so than, and women tend to engage in more internalizing behaviors. And so it's important to, the point here is that the way that men express depression looks different, and the way that men express negative moods are different than women. And we have to understand that and be able to embrace that if we're going to really treat men with the care and attention, and be able to be successful in supporting men when they're going through difficult times like this. And so it's important to acknowledge and recognize that men are more likely, typically men are diagnosed with depression at about half the rate that women are. But part of that is also not considering that men are twice as likely, or if not more, to die by suicide. And so part of this is back up one slide for me. Part of this is recognizing that there are these undiagnosed or uncharacterized, unlabeled aspects of depression that are likely in men's lives that are not being captured by the current way that we characterize depression in men. And so part of what I'm just highlighting here are, these are the kinds of things that you might want to pay attention to for those of you who are concerned about men, that you would want to explore further, even if they're not as likely to label it and define it as depression. Next slide. And so a lot of men don't think about, again, prostate cancer and so forth until they're actually, again, their health more generally, and certainly prostate cancer, prostate problems, until they actually have them. And there was somebody who I was talking to recently was reporting a story from another colleague that he said he talked to a man who basically said he didn't know what a prostate was until he developed prostate cancer. It didn't occur to him, and it never had been part of his life or part of his experience. And in the qualitative work that we've done over the years, it's not been uncommon for men to celebrate that they were, quote unquote, healthy enough to not have to have had to go to the doctor for anything in 10 years. And, while that's again, a way of thinking about health as this instrumental value, meaning that it's something that you have and can do, that it's not, and it's about what your body can do, less about, hey, I may actually have a problem, but because it's not affecting me, I'm still healthy. And so we have to get men out of this idea that the only way to tell if you're unhealthy or that you may need some additional attention is by just how you feel. How you feel is one part of it, but we also need to look for those things that you can't tell just by how you feel. Next slide. And so this idea of cancer and diabetes and depression being something that men grapple with is part of this challenge of thinking about prostate cancer and survivorship and so forth. And, you know, particularly with some of the more aggressive treatments and that are necessary, but nonetheless have implications for men's sexual function and so forth, that it is kind of this, am I better off basically dying with prostate cancer, or are those, or is it something that I'm losing in terms of my manhood, in terms of what my quality of life would be by not dealing with the cancer itself? And so this idea of darned if you do, darned if you don't, is part of the picture that we have to grapple with, and just the taboos of not wanting to talk about cancer. This was not my work, but this was just an important paper that I know that I wanted to sort of highlight, that talked specifically about this idea in the context of prostate cancer, that's particularly for survivors, that men tended to talk about and focus on. One of the biggest concerns that they were worried about was finding out that they had cancer, not because of just the health implications of it, but because it was about their potential loss of identity, masculinity, and sexual functioning. And so that was like, was it worth it for them to find out and deal with it? And that was part of the context, is how it would affect themselves. Next slide. And so one of the key things to remember, or that to this audience is probably not a surprise, is that, you know, when someone is diagnosed, when the man is diagnosed with prostate cancer, it's not just affecting him, it affects his whole life, you know, his whole community, family network. And one of the key roles, one of the key players in addressing cancer is, in particularly in men's lives, has been the roles of women, that women play at different points in the process and just throughout the process of helping men to navigate the cancer experience. And so one of the things that we did is did this, it's called a scoping review, which is basically to just look at what has been published about the different types of roles that women have played in men's prostate cancer journey, if you will. And we sort of broke it down into these three areas that map onto the ways that we think about social support and the types of supports that women play, the types of supports that women offer to men who are dealing with, the men who are dealing with prostate cancer. So that women often are a trusted informational source for men to help them make informed decisions, or to help, you know, be that ear and that collaborator in making, you know, choices about what kinds of things to do or not do in terms of treatment options and further screening and testing. That they're often the ones who are making the appointments, who, you know, give men the encouragement, in my air quotes, to go to the doctor, to get men to go and so forth, and to make the changes that are connected to prostate cancer, to living with prostate cancer in a healthy way. So the eating changes, the making changes that would reduce things like obesity, which can be a risk factor for aggressive prostate cancer. And so those kinds of things, if they're at risk, that dealing with obesity by changing lifestyle behaviors can be one of those things that women often play key roles in helping men to deal with at every point in the journey. And then the confidant, about men basically talking to women who help them, you know, not feel like they've lost who they are, and that it's often not just in men's heads that they're sort of grappling with these issues around prostate cancer and their loss of identity and so forth, but it's in engaging with women, often wives, daughters, nieces, and so forth, that they talk to about these kinds of things, or deal with these kinds of things somewhat directly and often indirectly, that give them a better sense of, no, you're still the man that you were before. It's not going to change who you are or who you are to me. I'm not going to love you any less. I'm not going to see you as any less. But that idea of being that confidant that reassures them that they're, just because they are not able to do things that they were doing before, whether it's sexually or other areas of their lives, that those things are not defining the men, but the men have to be have to understand that and that has to be reassured by somebody that they would be, that somebody's outside of them in that context. Next slide. And so these are just other quotes from other work that we've done, that we've done to just highlight some of these issues about women can help men, wives in particular can help men put their health in perspective. And again, even if you can't do certain things, she really wants you to be there and so forth, and that those things are important parts of the story. Next slide. And so again, prostate cancer, cancer in general, we have to understand these things in the larger context of men's lives. And prostate cancer is not just a threat in terms of health and mortality, but it often leads to questions about how men see themselves more fundamentally. And so if we're going to understand the ways to intervene as it relates to prostate cancer, we have to think about these things and how men define themselves in their relationships, and women can often play a critical role in that. So this is the last quote, just to remember that, you know, for men, it's to, you know, regardless, you're important, but you're not indispensable. And so you have to sort of recognize that there are things you can do and who you are is going to be important, but you're not just the sum of what you bring home, you know, financially, or what you do for your family. They want you to actually be there too. Next slide. Thank you. And so really quickly, just wanted to sort of introduce this Mighty Men study. It's a pace-based, we're recruiting churches and men from churches right now. And so here's the link to the study at the bottom. It's taking this research, this body of work that we have been doing over the years, and bringing it to bear in this program to basically help men create and live healthier lifestyles who may be at risk for cancer because of their weight and because they're overweight or obese. And so it's, next slide. And so it's a 6-month commitment that we're asking men to make. So it's a study that the men would be involved in for 6 months. The churches would be involved in for longer if they would be willing to do more than one round of the study. It's a small group based intervention. And we can talk about with the churches how to navigate the COVID context and just those kind of things. We're willing to sort of work with churches to engage and explore how they're going to be comfortable with those kinds of things. It's what's called a comparative study, meaning that everybody gets something. It's just a slightly different intervention. So one focuses just on exercise, the other one focuses more on just an overall lifestyle changes. Both groups get individualized text messages. Both groups get a Fitbit. And the churches also get resources, a small amount of exercise resources to facilitate and to host the small group exercise groups, in addition to the health education curriculum that the men in the different curriculum that they get. So we have that, as well as the exercise groups as well. And so just for more information, you know, contact me, the center. Tristan is our outreach coordinator, but here's all our contact information. So thank you.
Dr. Griffiths, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. Very thorough. Love the quotes. Gives it a very personal touch. So we do have about 6 minutes left, and we want to make sure, and would you be able to stay a few minutes longer, Dr. Griffith, if there are additional questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. And again, you know, we want to, anyone who's interested in reaching out regarding the Mighty Men program, please feel free to reach Dr. Griffith. We can put his email in the chat to email him, or you can always reach out to us and we can provide that information. So let's open it up to the to our participants. Are there any questions? Feel free to place it in the chat or share it or speak. Unmute yourself and you can share your question. We do ask that you please not provide any personal information, as this is being recorded. And in prostate cancer, it can be, there may be you know, personal questions related to the topic. So so please, we are open to questions.
I'll go for a question. This is Dawn Fishbein. So I know that you've really focused on, and much of your research focuses on men and Black men in particular. Is there anything that you could talk to us also being, Latin and Hispanic Heritage Month? Is there anything that you have ongoing in your research, or at least, work that you've done that could also talk about and equate, Hispanic men to the same still an underrepresented group of men in healthcare?
Yes, so actually we've done this similar formative work, and because of COVID, we weren't able to actually roll out the actual study, but we found a lot of similar parallels to the ways that Black men and Latinx men think about health and manhood. One of the slight differences was the men that we had talked to, and this was largely a Miami-based, largely Latinx men of Cuban descent, talked more about the family orientation, more than the faith orientation. So for Black men that we talked to in different spaces and cities where I've been, for a lot of men, their faith was sort of the anchor of defining sort of who they were as men, and that was what they learned through their faith tradition was really the foundation that shaped the way that they thought about what it meant to be a man, what their responsibilities were, and so forth. For Latinx men, it was really more replacing to a degree that with their family orientation was really central to their identity and to the way they saw themselves. And so we've included, when we do the tailoring part of this, we base it on these kinds of ideas and ideals. And we've included both actually in the tailoring tools that we're doing with studies with Latinx men and with Black men. And we'll just see, part of this is how high or low they are on those different things as individuals, because we don't want to, even though these are sort of broad sort of ideas, part of the way that we do the work is to recognize that each individual is different. And so we've got to ask him what his thoughts are about the way that he sees himself. And so part of this is providing a context for being able to do that kind of taking that information from men and then feeding it back and tailoring it to them as individuals.
Thank you.
So we do have one comment in the chat. It says, excellent information. Would recommend that this presentation be repeated multiple times. So that was from
Thank you,
Dr. Edmonds. Did we have someone who wants to ask a question?
Hi, Florencia, can I ask a question?
Of course, of course.
Yes, so this is Bernard Kwabiado from Howard University. Thank you very much for a very instructive presentation. I have a question regarding the heterogeneity of the Black population in the US. I'm of a recent West African migrant to US, and every time we go to hospital, we all put our name, we are stratified into African American and Black. Now, as you rightly put it, there are some unique differences and challenges that we face. And I was wondering, how can we begin to, stratify Blacks into different, ethnicity, not ethnicity, but, recent diaspora from Africa, from West Africa, from Caribbean, so we can really begin to address the issues that are unique to these populations.
Yeah, and I think for me, that's one of the things that drew me to moving to this area, is to start to be able to do that work, to be able to explore that. I think typically we've limited that to thinking about it in terms of biological factors. What I'm interested in, what I think is really potentially more important, because we haven't really seen that play out in very substantive ways, in the way that, as much as we have some of the cultural factors and some of the things that would affect sort of the ways that men engage with one another, the ways that they see themselves, and how they see and prioritize different roles, responsibilities, and so forth. So I think some of it is just starting to collect that information and do that work, to talk to men, to characterize that, and then to work with them to figure out how do we need to put that into messages with Black men around these kinds of things. And yeah, so one language would be, in the very traditional way, is to think about ethnic heterogeneity within the Black population is, I think,
Mhm.
one at least way to characterize what you're talking about. In the generations of immigration, you know, and so forth. My parents are both from Jamaica and Guyana, so you know, yeah, I definitely understand the what you're describing in terms of the heterogeneity. And so me being, you know, essentially second generation here, you know, first generation American, essentially, you know, with my parents both being immigrants, it's a different context and a different experience that I have versus them. And so I need to understand what my experience and life experience is and how that's different from theirs. But yeah, I think it's starting with just doing the work to really document there are these differences, and then being able to build that into studies to say, how do we need to do this differently?
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we'll take one more question, and then we do have a few more slides we'd like to share.
Oh,
We're happy to take one more question. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your participation. Please stick around. We have a few more slides. And Dr. Griffith, thanks again for your wonderful presentation. And we do hope that you will, we can call on you again for another, to do another presentation. So,
yes, thank you.
Wendy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Florencia and Dr. Griffith, for that wonderful presentation and for coming back to our community and bringing these important topics. A lot of you guys might be wondering, how can you potentially get more information and how can you get involved? We did develop a website. It's called We Partner for Research. And here we put a lot of topics that are important to our community as to how to, you know, to help you understand research terms that might be reported in the news or in research studies. And we invite everybody to visit our page to get to know about our work a little more. So other resources available if you're interested in getting involved in research is researchmatch.org. And here you can essentially enter your information and kind of like match your interests with various studies that many researchers may have going on. And again, this is just highlighting the website I was mentioning, which is our We Partner for Research site. Also, another really great way to get involved is through our Participant Advisory Board. And this is just a group of community members who come together once a month to provide feedback and information to researchers that are part of GITVC. And we do provide a small stipend for those that are interested, and we are seeking new members. And so those members are individuals. Ideally, we're looking for individuals who have interest in research, want to be that voice of the community. And ideally, if you have any experience with participating in studies or any research experience, you will be a great candidate for it. Feel free to scan the little barcode on the side, but we also share a link that you can follow and call us, and we will give you more information about how to get involved. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to be sending a link right now. So please copy that link and go take our survey. Over there, you can also ask your questions. You can tell us what other topics you like to hear about, and we will do our best to bring those topics to you. And our next event, we are planning our next event for December the 13th of this year. You can register here, and when you register, you will get reminders as well of our next topics. We're still working on the topic for next month. So during our survey, when you send us your answers, you can give us suggestions. And like I said, we'll do our best to bring those to you. So again, I cannot thank enough to our presenter, Dr. Griffith, our moderator, Florencia Gonzalez, and our entire team for bringing this. But most importantly, to all of our community members on this presentation tonight, this is for you, and we're happy that you join us. So if there are any other questions for tonight, we're going to adjourn here.